I climbed the rusted stairs while their laughter echoes from the valley like wind through teeth. They called the tower worthless, a hazard, a joke with a view. Yet my name is carved into its floor, Ilara, beneath flaking paint I've never touched. If I'm wrong, I'm only the fool they already see. If I'm right, I inherit a burden I can't return. The lock on the cabin door is fused to the hasp, welded by seasons. Something inside thumps in time with the gusts, as if the room breathes. Subscribe and write where you are watching this video from. No one could have predicted the emotional truth hidden inside. They read the will in a cramped office that smelled of paper and rain. My name came last, like an afterthought. To Ilara, the fire lookout on Ridge 9, and the parcel beneath it, free and clear. The clerk didn't hide his surprise. That old tower? A cousin coughed into his sleeve to cover a laugh. Someone muttered, "Sell the scrap." They were kind in the way of people relieved the burden wasn't theirs. I held the key ring and a folded map, as if either could make sense of why a ruin would choose me. The weight of the purchase pressed on me far heavier than any price tag could. At the diner that afternoon, a man tapped the newspaper and smirked. "That thing's a hazard. County'll knock it down. You'll save us all the trouble and pull the bolts, right?" I smiled without agreeing. My grandmother's photograph above the register watched from a frame. Stern mouth, bright eyes. A woman who, rumor said, never cried at weddings or funerals. At dawn, I drove to the ridge. The road ended in grass and silence. Against the sky, the tower loomed. 4 rusted legs, a corroded stair cage, the cabin perched like a clenched fist. The air was heavy with dust and the faint sweetness of long-decayed hay from the abandoned field below. The first step flexed under my boot, brittle as a scab. I clipped in, testing each rung with my weight, counting breaths. The metal sang a low, uneasy note as I climbed. The valley shrank into a quilt of roofs and furrows. Wind pressed my jacket flat. My hands tasted of iron. Against one wall of the landing rested the rusting skeleton of a rain barrel, riddled by weather. The cabin door had swollen into its frame. The lock was fused to the hasp with a bloom of oxidation, a flower that refused to open. I crouched and ran my fingers over the deck. Beneath scales of paint, the wood gave slightly, soft in places. I scraped carefully with my pocket knife, peeling back a layer the color of old bone. Letters emerged, thin and careful, notched by a steady hand. E.M. The initials were my grandmother's. There were more, nearly lost to weather, a grove of names etched into the floorboards as if claiming witness. I traced E.M. and felt a small electric sorrow. A gust rattled the windows. Something inside shifted. Tick, tick. A hard object rolling until the wind died. The silence thickened as I leaned closer to the jamb. I could smell old oil, mouse droppings, a sour metallic tang that felt like a secret kept too long. The corroded padlock wouldn't budge. I sat back and let the cold of the railing enter my palms. Under the lower rail, where the metal met wood, a line of darkness caught my eye. I slid my fingers in and touched paper, brittle, damp around the edges. It was wedged so tightly, I had to pry with the keyring. A ledger slid free, no larger than my hand, bound in cracked blackboard. On the first page, a column of dates marched without explanation. Beside some, a single phrase appeared in pencil. Silence kept. The pressure of the words had indented the page below. I turned pages. The handwriting shifted over the years, sharper, then rounder, then cramped, as if the same rule continued through different hands. There were storm symbols, triangles for wind, jagged lines for lightning, circles shaded for smoke. Names appeared in the margins, then were crossed out so carefully the paper dug through. I closed it and pressed it to my chest. The more I read, the clearer the picture became. Not yet a picture of what, only that the tower had been keeping a record of something more than weather. Yet beneath my determination, unease coiled. The truth was worse than idle gossip. It was organized. I walked down with the ledger under my jacket, every step a prayer against brittle metal. On the ground, the tower's shadow cut across the grass like a sundial of iron. The valley road glinted far below. Somewhere, a dog barked, oblivious. That night, the ledger lay open on my kitchen table. Under the lamp, dates aligned with clippings I pulled from the library's digitized archives. Wildfire reports, evacuation advisories, the same days, the same storms. Next to them, in pencil, that phrase, silence kept. I didn't sleep. By morning, I had a harness ordered, a better grinder borrowed, and a promise sealed inside my ribs. I would restore access, not for profit, not for spectacle, but to translate the ledger's code. It was not just discovery. It was inheritance. I returned at first light. The wind had a voice up there, a hollow echo moving through the cage, humming against the ladder as if reminding me to hurry. I touched the fused lock with 2 fingers and said aloud, "I'm coming." The tower did not answer. It only waited, unyielding, patient, like a beast watching from the dark. The goal was simple in shape and impossible in the hand. Open the cabin without destroying it, and learn why the ledger counted storms like prayers. I clipped my harness, felt the tug of the line against my waist, and began the ascent. The valley's roofs blinked up at me like indifferent eyes. People had started parking at the pullout to watch, their silhouettes propped against hoods, their certainty folded into crossed arms. The first obstacle greeted me in red-brown silence. Bolts flowered with corrosion, heads rounded to soft circles. The lock was a single rusted knot, metal fused to metal. I tested a tread. It crumbled along one edge like burnt sugar. Fear rose fast and intrusive. Falling here wouldn't be a dramatic lesson, just an erasure. I set the grinder to the hasp and watched a comet tail of sparks shear away, bright against the gray. The air filled with the acrid smell of scorched iron. My hands trembled until I whispered numbers to regulate them, not a prayer, but a sequence. 3 passes. Cool, 3 passes. Heat softened the oxide, then made the surrounding sheet metal weep. I stopped. The cabin skin was thin. Force would tear it like paper. I mapped the structure instead. Chalk lines along the jambs. Tap tests for sound. Dull where rot lurked, bright where wood still held. I traced stress paths down the cage and into the legs, calculating where a brace might borrow rigidity. It was not just work. It was negotiation with a patient animal that remembered pain. I wedged fur struts under the first flight, wrapped them with cargo straps, and tightened until the groans quieted. Each ratchet click felt like a held breath released. I scraped the ciphered notes off the inside siding where wind and rain had driven ink bleeds through cracks. Short clusters of marks reappeared, triangles nested, lines doubled. A code, that kept its own weather. By dusk, the wind freshened. Metal began to tick in the cooling air, slow at first, then with unnerving precision. 4 taps, a pause. 4 taps, a pause. I stilled my breath and counted. The pattern repeated, not random contraction, but a metronome. I pressed my ear to the cabin siding. The tower spoke in thermal cadence. I couldn't tell if that comforted or warned. Back home, the ledger pages received new dates when I cross-referenced the county's archived wildfire bulletins. Storm days matched. Names hovered beside them in pencil, then a hard line of graphite crossing each out until the paper bruised. The names were not just officials. They were ranch families. The more I read, the clearer the picture became. Silence kept was not a phrase. It was policy. At the hardware store, a neighbor leaned on the counter and let his voice carry. "Family stories are best left alone," he said, eyes on me, smile for the clerk. "Some of us still have to live here." The clerk rang up cutting wheels with a stare fixed at the cash drawer. I nodded, as if accepting weather. On the sidewalk, the preacher's wife passed and didn't see me, or pretended not to. I returned at noon to avoid the morning crowd. The sun burned the rust to a deeper red. I slid a slim pry bar into the hatch seam where the door had swollen into its frame. The bar creaked. The wood shivered. I backed off and pulled screws from the hinge plates one at a time, slow, easing pressure so the brittle steel wouldn't shear and leave me nothing to hold. One screw head broke, as though relieved to be done. I whispered, noted its failure, and set a new strategy: heat, then cold. A propane torch licked the metal, then an ice pack hissed. Thermal shock loosened what my strength couldn't. Half an inch opened like a reluctant eyelid. Through the crack, darkness smelled of iron filings and old rain. My light found a floor where dust had sculpted drifts, and there, bolted to the gray boards like a small altar, sat an iron box, low and square, with corners rounded by decades of wind-driven grit. It wore a ring of tarnish where hands had once touched it, again and again, then stopped. I couldn't get more than 2 fingers through the gap. The sight of the box was a revelation that tasted like metal. The ledger had a body now. I taped the opening, labeled the datum points I'd measured, and retreated to rebuild my approach. The tower swayed when I shifted my weight. Each movement sent a wave into the cabin frame, and the door muttered its refusal. Night settled with a chill that tunneled under my jacket. The ticking returned, faster, impatient. 4 taps. Pause. 4 taps. I answered by grounding the cage with a copper strap to bleed static and reassure myself that control remained possible. The noise persisted. Not static. Heat and memory speaking their language. At home, I pinned the day's rubbings along the kitchen wall. Margins from ledger pages repeated a set of initials: E.M., E.M., E.M. Then a line through them, then E.M. again, faint, as though written under someone else's hand. My grandmother's signature appeared in a photo from the archives beneath a fire map. The caption read, "Anonymous Volunteer." The truth was worse. It had a familiar pen stroke. I closed my eyes. The weight of history sat heavy in my hands. I had no choice but to continue. The iron box waited above the valley like a sealed throat. The tower would open without breaking. Or I would learn where refusal lives and why. The goal sharpened. Unbolt the iron box and read what was meant to be hidden. I went up before sunrise, when the metal was cool and least likely to betray me. The ladder resisted like a bad memory. At the landing, I knelt and slid a mirror through the crack, angling light across the bolts that cinched the box to the floor. Their heads were domed with corrosion, threads lost in swollen wood. The tower swayed with my smallest shift, a slow pendulum that turned each movement into risk. I braced my boots wide and breathed in counts against the motion. Heat first. The torch flared, haloing rust in wavering gold. I heated one bolt until it sang, then quenched with a rag soaked from my water bottle. Steam hissed up, carrying the acrid smell of iron and old varnish. I tried the wrench through the narrow gap, just enough bite to test. The head rounded, sheared. I swallowed the small curse and marked it in pencil on the jamb. The structure complained in a low, hollow tone, a voice that wanted patience, not force. I changed the plan. First, secure the room to my weight. I crawled under the cabin with slats and ratchet straps, building a lattice that kissed each joist. The silence thickened as I tightened webbing until the groans eased. Above, I catalogued the remnants a careful hand had left, county maps with the edges softened by greasy fingers, a radio chassis stripped of tubes, a coil of antenna wire braided around a nail, ration tins stacked in a crate, their labels flayed by time, revealed stamped dates that echoed the ledger, witnesses that had been waiting in dust. From a drawer worked shut, I pried loose a bundle tied with cotton string grown brittle. Tags, cardstock gone the color of tea. On each, a typed field, evac status. Most were stamped in purple ink. Approved. A smaller stack bore a hard red block that read, evac denied. The first tag with that denial carried my surname in a corner, stamped, not handwritten. I felt the words before I read them, the way a body knows the shape of a blow. My fingers left a faint print in the dust as I set them down. The tower pitched slightly as if in sympathy. I turned to the wall by the window and brushed dirt from the boards. In the dim, a palimpsest of handwriting surfaced. The same precise hand I had seen in the ledger margins lay beneath a film of smoke. Notations of wind direction, fuel moisture, then a thin line in graphite. Keep watch when siren fails. The letters were my grandmother's. The line wavered once, then steadied. She had written it like an instruction to herself. I carried that sentence down the stairs and into town because I needed to see it in their faces. The preacher had chosen his text well that week. He spoke of pride, of towers men raised, of watchfulness turning to arrogance. He didn't say my name. He didn't need to. Eyes slid toward me like thrown stones. I sat in the back pew and kept the tags in my pocket, and the sentence on my tongue. When the hymn rose, thin and dutiful, I stood and sang, not defiance, alignment. If they named my work as pride, I would let the wind judge. By afternoon, I was back on the landing with a cold chisel I had ground thin as a blade. I drove it under the lip of the sheared bolt and worried it free with a patient rocking, taking what little metal the years had spared. One bolt came. Then another froze and snapped, a brittle pop that tingled in my teeth. The tower swayed once, twice. I waded through the motion, cheek against the floor, listening to the substructure talk. The silence that followed was not peace. It was calculation. I slid my arm shoulder deep through the crack, skin rasping paint and splinters. The box's lid had its own lock, a squat cylinder with a slot deformed by force. I worked the pick set I'd brought, hearing only the wind's low vowel through the railings and my own breath. Click, a false set. The tower creaked a slow admonition, and the floor under my chest shifted. I withdrew fast and lay still until the sway settled. I set a second brace against the far wall, then lashed the cabin to the stair cage with 2-inch webbing, turning the structure into a tense triangle. The metal calmed under that geometry. Back at the lid, I tried again. The pick found purchase. A tiny, tired snap. The cylinder turned a 1/4 inch and stuck. I eased the thin pry under the seam and lifted. The hinge protested, then gave in a sigh. Inside, spool tapes lay nested like dark moons, each labeled with a pencil date. A field log bound in oilskin rested beside them, edges swollen and wave-marked. On top sat a ring of keys stamped in small letters, Lookout Circuit. The ring was cold and heavy, a history in my hand. The weight of the discovery pressed on me far heavier than any treasure could. I slid one tape into my bag, the log under my jacket, the keys around my neck where a bell might have hung. The tower seemed to breathe out, as if relieved. Backing away, I scanned the room once more. In the corner, my grandmother's pencil mantras rode the wall like veins. Keep watch when siren fails. Under it, a thinner line, almost erased. Keep quiet when road is closed. I didn't want to understand it yet, but I did. And as I shut the door to the crack again, the metal ticked 4 times. Pause. 4 times. The room aligned its pulse to mine, unwilling to let me pretend that what I carried down the stairs was anything but a burden that would not be returned. The goal narrowed like a beam through fog. Play the tapes, read the log, and find the pattern that had outlived its authors. I spread the oilskin on my table and peeled it back with slow care. The field log smelled of rain that had dried decades ago. Ink had bled along fibers like veins. Inside, columns listed watch hours, wind speed, fuel breaks, and then, without ceremony, names. Some had a thin line through them. Others wore the phrase silence kept in a steady, unflinching hand. The first obstacle was mechanical and intimate. The spools were 1/4 inch, brittle, the leader tapes frayed. The recorder they expected was extinct. I soldered a makeshift player from a scavenged head, a rebuilt capstan, and a belt cut from an old sewing machine. It rattled like a tired clock. My house lights hiccuped when the motor surged, the grid's breath unreliable as always. I set a car battery on the floor and clipped in, building a small island of power. The first tape hissed alive. Static roared like wind trapped in a throat. Beneath it, voices bled through, clipped, urgent, flattened by distance. Lookout 9 reads smoke north by east, requesting clearance for Pine Gate. Children at the ferry road. Another voice, calmer, official, replied through the noise. Hold, protect town first. A long pause, then a simple, final, deny. The silence afterward felt heavier than the hiss. I stopped the reels and stared at the wall. The more I listened, the clearer the picture became, and the less I wanted it to be true. I threaded a second tape. The same cadence, plead, wait, refuse. Names I'd read in the margins surfaced, their syllables worn by static. Between them, I heard the room itself, the scrape of a chair leg, a soft exhale, a pencil on paper. The tower's breath caught on magnetic iron. Complication arrived in a human voice I knew only from photographs. In the log's middle pages, a different hand began annotating the routine. The letters were my grandmother's, square and controlled. Siren fails, road holds. Close west spur, silence kept. On the next page, in the margin, we do not choose, we carry. She realized too late that the difference didn't matter. The burden was hers anyway. I pressed play again. A storm rose in the tape, the microphone swallowing wind. Lookout 9 to Ridge 2. Fire leapfrogged the creek. We need an opening at Stone Cut. The reply stumbled, then steadied. Negative. Maintain closure. Protect the core. The truth was worse than rumor. It wore procedure like armor. The twist came on the fourth tape. The log's clean lines broke into short, haunted notes. Meeting. 3 lookouts, 1 county deputy, 1 pastor. Pact affirmed. Outliers sacrificed to save the basin. Rotating closures to confuse. Records dispersed across circuit. It was not just discovery. It was inheritance of a decision that reshaped a valley and then taught itself to forget. An ethical crisis braided through my ribs. My grandmother's signature appeared below entries authorizing closures. Not an initial, a full name. The same stroke I had traced in the cabin's dust. In the ledger, silence kept had been the mark of compliance. In my house, that mark became a mirror. Time was running out to decide whether I would keep it too. I threaded the last tape with shaking hands. The reels turned, the head whispered. For a while, only static. Then a lullaby bled through, low and fragile, hummed against the wind. The microphone must have been near a window. I could hear the rails vibrate. The voice, hers, I felt it, carried simple notes, a tune for a child or a sentinel who could not sleep. Hush, little, hush. The words dissolved. At the very end, the tape stuttered. A breath. Then my name, spoken softly, as if into the wood. Ilara. The reels spun a moment longer, then emptied. I rewound with the care I hadn't given my own breath. The room felt too small for what the air now held. I opened the window and let the night in. The valley's lights glittered, indifferent. Across town, unaware of the danger in the story they'd built, people set alarms, locked doors, and rehearsed innocence. I turned back to the log and followed the pattern across decades. Storm icons aligned with closures, closures aligned with denials, denials aligned with births and graves in the local notices. It was a lattice woven so tightly it passed for landscape. Everything changed when I realized the tower did not act alone. In the bottom of the box, beneath the tapes, a penciled list named Other Peaks. Keys stamped Lookout Circuit matched those names. The ring around my neck was not just a relic. It was a map. Tension gathered at the edges of the next decision. I wanted to take the tapes to the county, to a reporter, to the preacher whose sermon I had endured, to anyone who could share the weight. I wanted also to drive the whole box into the river and watch the current carry the voices into perfect silence. He had no choice but to keep the wind for himself, the old story went. I had no choice but to let it speak. I packed the recorder, the first 3 tapes, the log and the ledger into a canvas bag. The tower would be my witness and my gallows. The wind rose against the eaves, a dark, steady pulse. As the door closed behind me, I thought of the lullaby, of the soft way she said my name, not as absolution, but as assignment. The moment I left, everything felt lighter and stranger. The valley's road curved toward the ridge, and the tower waited where it always had, corroded, unyielding, and patient. Above the stairs, the cabin's silhouette held a history of refusals. Tonight, it would hold a voice. The goal pressed simple and merciless. Confront the truth publicly or carry it alone. Decide what this legacy means, not just for me, but for the ground that raised us. I taped a notice to the diner's corkboard in a square of clean light. Listening night at Ridge 9. Elders first. Bring memory, not judgment. By noon, a telephone rang like a warning. Trespass doesn't change because it's yours, a voice said. Road access crosses my land. You block it with your circus, I'll have you cited. I recognized the landowner's tone before his name. I thanked him for the courtesy of a threat and hung up with clean hands. At dusk, I hauled the canvas bag to the base and waited. 3 cars came. 2 men sat, arms folded, then left without opening their doors. A woman climbed with me, step by slow step, her breath careful. We reached the landing and I played the first tape. The hiss rose. The denial fell. Her fingers tightened around the railing like a prayer. My brother, she said after it ended, voice flat with an old decision. They said a controlled closure took the road. He walked into smoke. We never found him. She didn't cry. The valley had taught her not to. Word moved faster than my caution. The landowner returned at sunrise with a folded letter and a deputy who looked embarrassed by his own badge. Unsafe structure, the paper read. Condemnation proceedings pending. The deputy met my eyes and murmured, "They'll bring a crew." The tower behind us groaned in a wind that had not yet arrived. I posted a second notice on the fence. Hearing tapes at dusk. All welcome. The preacher's voice reached my porch that afternoon from a radio left on to keep the house from feeling abandoned. Pride disguises itself as witness, he said. False watchmen guard false fires. I switched it off and listened to the real wind. It did not sermonize. It scraped and waited. By the third evening, a small knot of elders stood at the pullout, coats buttoned to throats despite the warm air. I climbed. They climbed. We filled the cabin with bodies the room had not held in decades. I read from the field log. I played the lullaby. When the name crossed the tape, mine, spoken across years, the oldest woman closed her eyes and whispered a name of her own that was not mine. I understood. We carry. We do not choose. The landowner tried again at dawn, this time with county forms clipped to a board and a foreman who kept glancing up like a man measuring where a thing would fall. You'll want to step aside, he said, polite as a knife. Safety perimeter. My harness hung from the rail like a dare. I clipped in, looped chain through the stair cage, and locked myself to the spine of the tower with a ring-stamped lookout circuit. The metal was cool, unyielding. We can cut you out, the foreman warned. I nodded. You can try. The day stretched, thin and brittle. Heat rose from the valley fields. People gathered because people always do when a spectacle promises consequence. Some brought folding chairs, as if this were summer theater. A reporter in boots too clean for the ridge photographed me through the chain. "Why?" she asked. I lifted the bag of tapes to the bars, proof, heavy and ugly. "Because the tower has a voice," I said, "and so do the people who were left outside its decisions." Her eyes flicked to the crowd, to the landowner, to the deputy who had returned with his hat in his hands. "Will you speak it tonight?" she asked. "All of it." I could have hidden. I could have waited for the paperwork to smother the problem in process. Yet beneath my determination, unease coiled tighter. If I stayed silent now, I became the ledger's next mark. Silence kept. The truth was worse than ruin. It was comfortable. The foreman signaled his crew. A saw whined at the base, teeth kissing chain. I wrapped the links in canvas to gum the cut and felt the vibration travel up through the spine into my ribs. The tower swayed as if deciding whom to carry. "Dusk," I called down to the reporter over the saw's grind. "From the cabin, everything." She nodded, her camera a single unblinking eye that made the valley honest for a moment. The saw bogged and died. Applause rose, ragged and quick. The landowner glared at the deputy. The deputy studied his boots. The preacher stood behind his truck door, watching me as if waiting for a confession I hadn't learned to say. The woman whose brother vanished touched the first rung and whispered, "I'll be there." That promise steadied me more than the harness did. Clouds gathered on the far ridge, a dark seam pulling itself closed. The tower's joints clicked 4 times. Pause. 4 times. The pattern had become law. I leaned my forehead against the cage and listened. It was not just discovery. It was inheritance, faced in public air. At the edge of the crowd, a boy tugged his mother's sleeve. "What's she going to do?" he asked. She answered without looking away. "She's going to tell the wind our names." I looked down at the tapes, then at the valley that had laughed and loved and refused to choose. "Dusk," I said again, to them, to myself, to the ridge. "Meet me at the top." Dusk pulled a bruise across the sky as I unclipped the last safety and stepped onto the landing with the canvas bag. The crowd below was a hush of faces and hats. A dark constellation gathered where the grass bent toward the road. The reporter tested her mic and pointed it upward like a question mark. The preacher folded his arms. The landowner's jaw worked like he'd bitten a stone. The wind, at last, arrived. Goal was simple: transmit what the tower held to anyone with a radio and a conscience. I set the recorder on a plank I'd leveled with shims, clipped the car batteries together in a series the log had once sketched, and lashed an antenna to the rail with the same webbing that had held the cabin steady while I learned to listen. The generator I'd borrowed coughed twice and sagged. The needle on its panel fluttered, then fell, failing. My hands worked without consultation, rerouting through the battery bank I'd dragged up before noon. I spoke into the handheld, voice low. "Ridge 9 broadcast, community band. Tune your dials. No music tonight. Only weather and truth." The tower groaned, not in warning, but in age. The stairs shuddered under someone's weight 2 flights below. Slow, respectful steps. The woman whose brother vanished climbed until her breath reached me. "I'll hold whatever you need," she said. I nodded and gave her the antenna mast while I bound the coax to its feed. The wind lifted the cord and tried to play it like a string. I read first. The field log lay on my knee, oilskin peeled back like a map that finally admitted what it had drawn. Watch hours, 1900 to 0300. Wind east-northeast. Fuel heavy in the gullies. Siren out. Keep watch when siren fails. I let the sentence hang until the room took it in. Names submitted for opening, denied. Silence kept. The radio hissed and then steadied. Down in the crowd, hands found each other. I pressed play. The tape's hiss became weather. Lookout 9 to base, requesting Pine Gate. The denial fell clean as a blade. I paused and let the silence live a full breath. You're hearing what I found in a box bolted to your tower, I said into the mic. You're hearing a policy that called itself protection and taught our grandparents to look away. The wind surged, the antenna strained. A rivet snapped somewhere below, a crisp, small betrayal. The cabin swayed. I had to choose between finishing and safety in a body that wanted both. The woman tightened her grip on the mast. "Keep going," she whispered, as if to a child reluctant to speak. I admitted what I had to. The signature authorizing closures on these pages. I swallowed, then forced the sentence clean. It's my grandmother's. My name is on the floor. My voice is on the last tape. The ledger that wrote silence kept did not come from strangers. I felt the crowd recoil and lean in both at once, as people do when the truth includes their dinner tables. I played the next cut. Static. Then the official cadence that had ruled a century. Protect town first. I answered live. No town is protected by the erasure of its outskirts. No church is honored by the loss of its people to its own gatekeeping. The preacher looked down. The landowner's mouth opened, then closed. Somewhere, a child asked what that meant. A mother shushed gently, and I loved her for the soft hand. The generator tried once more, then died. The batteries held. The tower's rails vibrated like a tuning fork in the wind's fist. Lightning stitched the far ridge with pale thread, close enough to widen every pupil below. The storm moved fast. I had minutes. A thin whistle bled from under the floorboard. Not wind this time. A scene lifted that shouldn't have. I hooked 2 fingers and pried gently. Nails squealed. Beneath the plank lay a sheath of paper folded tight as a fist. Evacuation approvals unsigned, dates matching closures that never were. The truth was worse than negligence. It was convenience dressed as mercy, then left in a hole. I read the titles into the mic. Approvals prepared but not filed. Routes mapped, never opened. Names at the top of the list. I didn't say who wrote them. I didn't have to. The valley already knew how to finish a pattern. The radio's red light held. I set the last tape on the spindle. For those who need a human voice, not just policy. The lullaby drifted out, thin over static, soft against the teeth of the wind. The tower hummed along its rails. When my name arrived, whispered like a tender accusation, the crowd fell so quiet I could hear the intake of breath from the road. Lightning threw every face into brief relief. Tears, anger, calculation, emptiness, hope. The lullaby ended. I let the silence sit, rich and hard. I will unseal every record, I said, on mic, voice steady because it had to be. I will name every road closed and every person left on the wrong side of a line. Our inheritance is not guilt alone. It is responsibility. The wind hit us broadside. The mast jerked. The woman's knuckles blanched. Another rivet parted with a sharp, decisive ping. I cut the feed clean, secured the proof under my jacket, and lashed the floorboard closed with 2 wraps of webbing. Below, The deputy lifted his hat. The reporter lowered her camera. The landowner stared at the ground. The preacher placed his hand flat on his truck, as if to steady it. I swung the antenna down and hugged the mast like a spar. The storm claimed the ridge. The tower held. And for the first time since I climbed it, the crowd did not leave. They waited, looking up, faces wet with rain. Morning found the ridge rinsed clean, the tower beaded with rain like sweat after confession. The crowd had thinned to clusters, silent, practical, changed. I unlashed the webbing, checked the rivets that had held and the ones that hadn't, and carried the box down in both arms like a sleeping animal. The deputy walked beside me, saying nothing, his hat dark with water. At the road, he cleared his throat. "Where do you take something like that?" I answered without ceremony. "Where memory has a catalog number." The archives smelled of paper and faint bleach, and the stubbornness of people who keep receipts for a living. I laid the tapes, the ledger, the field log, and the unsigned approvals on a long table. The archivist didn't ask for a story. She asked for dates. She asked for provenance. She asked for permissions that my signature could not confer. "We'll make copies," she said. "Multiple formats, redundant storage. You keep the originals under your lock until we're done." It was not just discovery, it was stewardship. I posted a hand-lettered sign at the base. Listening night. First Thursday, sundown. Bring a chair, bring a name. The first month, 6 came. The second, 16. They sat in the shadow of the legs while I read entries and played the cleanest transfers the archivist could coax from the tapes. When denial fell, people didn't gasp anymore. They nodded, like farmers reading weather. After, some walked to the fence and touched the wire, as if it could carry something back to them besides current. Apologies arrived crooked and incomplete. A man who had mocked me at the diner set a paper sack by the steps, honey, a jar of pickles, a hand-scribbled note that said simply, "I didn't know." He couldn't look at me. I let him keep that. Others avoided the ridge. Their porches brightened at night as if defiance could be measured in lumens. A few brought offerings to the base, photographs, letters folded to the size of coins, a child's shoe kept for no reason anyone could name. I didn't curate the pile. I let it accumulate like a cairn. Sleep changed. Smoke braided itself through my dreams. Roads closed under my feet. In the worst nights, my grandmother's handwriting moved across a wall I couldn't reach, and the pencil broke just before she finished the sentence. I woke with my throat raw and climbed. The silence thickened as I ascended, then eased at the landing, as if the air up there remembered how to be honest. Young hands joined mine. Volunteers came with quiet skill. Students, a welder between jobs, a carpenter whose tools had outlived his father. We replaced treads, sistered stringers, set new bolts where old ones had grown fragile and secretive. They did not ask for a plaque. They asked for torque specs. They asked where to carry the next brace. It was not penance. It was maintenance. I kept a log of repairs taped to the cabin wall beside the old mantras. At the bottom, under EM, I carved a new line, straight and small so it wouldn't pretend to shout. Silence ended. The knife slipped once and caught my thumb. Blood dotted the floor like punctuation. I left it. The tower did not care for sterile narratives. The county returned with a different tone. Inspectors climbed, measured, frowned in professional ways, then nodded. The landowner stayed in his truck and watched through the glass. The preacher came on a Wednesday afternoon and asked to hear the lullaby alone. We stood in the little room. I played it. When my name arrived, he closed his eyes and said, "We'll read the names aloud on Sunday." Not absolution. Alignment. Some afternoons I sat under the legs and listened to nothing on purpose. Wind moved through the lattice, a low consonant. Children traced the footprint of the tower with chalk, a bright outline around an old bolt. The weight of the discovery pressed on me far heavier than any treasure could. But it had shifted, distributed across hands, across air. At dusk on the fourth listening night, a girl raised her hand. "Who decides now?" she asked. I looked at the keys on their hook, the ring that once cinched silence. "We do," I said, together and loudly. At dusk, the cabin stands open, the ring of keys hanging where a bell once was, the ledger and log copied and shelved, the originals sealed for witness. I listen as the wind moves through the rails, carrying names that no ledger can cross out again. Subscribe and write where you are watching this video from, and tell me the forgotten places near you that are still holding their breath. Follow the channel to uncover more forgotten legacies and bring a name to the next story. We'll say it out loud.